Hey guys, Tepcocyclerepair here. Today we're going to be talking about carburetors and why they leak. I'm going to give you 10 reasons why they leak. Some are really common and some are not so common. I'm going to show you all of them. We're going to get those carburetors to stop leaking on your bikes. Stay tuned. Please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share this video. It really helps me out, guys. Let's get started. All right, guys, so I got a couple different styles of carburetors here. A regular slide carburetor. I have a CV carburetor. I have a lawnmower type carburetor. But what I'm going over here is going to go over it's going to cover all different kinds of carburetors, whatever you have in your shed. So basically we're going to start out with just telling you what a carburetor does and what's going on inside of it. Very basics here. We have carburetor here. We have our floats. We have our float needle. Our float needle sits inside of our float seat. We have our float bowl, and we have our float overflow tube. It sticks out right there. Okay, this goes together. When this goes together, it fills up with gasoline. When gasoline fills up in here, it fills up the float. The float rises. As it rises, it pushes the needle into the needle seat, and when the needle hits the top of the needle seat, it cuts the fuel off and it stops fuel flowing into the carburetor. Done. All right. If you have a fuel petcock on your motorcycle or ATV, and that's in the off position, and your carburetor is leaking gas, even though the petcock's in the off position, you have a problem with your petcock and your carburetor. There's more than one problem there. But we're going to be talking about carburetors today. So a couple of these things here are very common, and some are not. So first of all, this tube right here, on older bikes, this can crack on the side, and you can get fuel that flows into the side. A lot of old Hondas and stuff, if you guys doing any cafe builds, and you have a leak and you've gone over everything else, check this tube right here. You can rebraze this if it's cracked. You can put a fuel line over it from like a lawnmower or something. Those yellow fuel lines that fit really tight over it to try to seal it. Best thing to do is to find that crack. Easy way to do that, put a tube on here, cap this with your finger, fill this with water, blow into the hose, and you'll see bubbles coming out of that hose. And if there's any bubbles coming out of there, you need to seal it up. It'll constantly leak. There's no way to stop that. That's one way there. Another one is going to be the needle seat. So the needle seat, okay, if we pull the pin out here and pull this out, the needle seat is down inside here. This is a new carburetor. This is nice and clean in there. Ethanol fuels and stuff are bringing a lot of water and stuff into carburetors and causing a lot of corrosion issues. And one of the things that happens, it'll eat the top of that needle seat. So the needle seat will get corroded to the point, and I have a picture in one of my other videos, it pitted it out so much that no matter how you tried to seal it in there, the float needle just couldn't seal it. That rubber tip couldn't seal it because it was so pitted. So you got to get a magnifying glass. Use something like, I use something like this right here, and I'll look down in there, and you can see little tiny pits all in there. If that's the case, you got to try to replace that. Some carburetors you can replace it, and some you can't. All right, so that's number two. Number three is going to be our hard rubber on the needle. So here's our float needle right here. This has a soft rubber flexible tip. This tip has to be rubber and has to be soft so that when it goes up into that needle seat, all right, goes up into the needle seat, it will seal it and it won't let it leak at all. If this rubber is hard, it's not going to flex, it's not going to be rubbery, it's not going to seal it, and it's going to constantly leak. Also, you want to look at this and make sure there's not a ring around it. If there's a worn out ring around it, you need to replace that. All right, so another one's going to be, one of the common ones is going to be a stuck float needle. So if you let this carburetor sit for a long time, what will happen is you'll have your float needle that's sitting inside there. It's got some fuel sitting on it. It gums up a little bit, and that float will be stuck. So as you fill it up with fuel, the fuel level will come up, and the float will stay here. That's why you see a lot of people like hitting the sides of the carburetor to try to free it up. You're just trying to jar the carburetor so that it frees this up and it starts to move again. So sometimes the float will be stuck down. Fuel will constantly come in, fill up the carburetor, go out of the overflow, and just constantly leak. Tap the side of that. If you have to tap the side of your carburetor to get your float to free up, to stop it from leaking, pull your carburetor off and clean it. Don't beat the crap out of your carburetor trying to get it to stop leaking. Take it off, do it right, fix it. All right, so moving on to our fifth one is going to be a cracked float. So these floats right here, sometimes they can crack. It's more common on the brass ones, the older style carburetor floats. They're metal and they'll crack. There's a seam that's welded around them, and sometimes they'll crack, and if they crack, they'll start to suck in the fluid. So when you put it in, gasoline, gas fills the float fills up with fluid, and then it'll sink and it won't float like it's supposed to. If it doesn't float, it's not going to be able to come up and cut your fuel off. So make sure your floats are good. Easy way to do that is get a bucket with water, just dunk it down in there and hold it, and make sure that you're not getting any bubbles. If you're getting any bubbles, it's filled. A lot of times you can take it and shake it, and you can see if there's any fluid inside there. These have to be completely sealed, and they can't take on any fluid or else they'll sink. All right, so another problem, a very common problem, is going to be dirt in the seat. So the needle and seat need to seal up here. We talked about that, sealing up nice and clean. So as the needle goes inside the seat, there can't be any debris inside here. If there's debris inside here, that won't be able to seal up in there good. So how does debris get in there? Well, a lot of times it'll be from garbage in your fuel. It's getting past the filter. If you don't have a fuel filter on your bike, it's going to get through there. So some of these bikes have fuel filters on the fuel petcock inside the tank. Some of them don't have that, or it's broken off or deteriorated inside the tank, and it's going to be letting all crap down your fuel line into the carburetor. It's going to try to bypass the needle, which there's not a lot of room in there to get past it. So if that happens, this is not going to be able to seal. Now also, sometimes we talked about the floats being stuck. There could be debris in here, and when you hit the side of it, it frees up the junk. It passes the float needle and it seals. So make sure there's no crap inside of here. Also, fuel lines can start to deteriorate from the inside, regular rubber fuel lines, and they'll start to come apart and fill up your lines, and it'll dump down into here and it'll clog it. So make sure you got no dirt and debris inside of your fuel lines. And you'll be able to see that when you pull your bowl off. If you look inside here and there's a lot of crap in here, you got to check your fuel, make sure your fuel's coming in there nice and clean. All right, so another problem, and I see this a lot in Polaris and some of the old Yamahas, is this O-ring right here. So this is a removable seat, all right? It's a needle float seat. So you have this one right here. Some of them have a Phillips head screw, and there's a little metal plate that holds this down into place. If you take your finger, stick it on that, and jiggle that around, it moves it all, you have a bad O-ring, you need to pull it out. And what happens there is that it will fill up the carburetor with fuel, and when it fills it up with fuel, the needle works good, it'll cut it off, and then the fuel is going to go past it, and go past this O-ring, and continue to fill up the bowl. And it'll just act like it's never cutting the fuel off, so it'll constantly fill it, and it'll overflow, and you'll have the same problem. So make sure that this O-ring right here is good. And this was a bad one. You can buy a whole needle and seat usually. It comes as a kit. Depends on your carburetor. And it comes with a complete kit, needle and seat. That's what I would do for any bike. Any of these old bikes that you're doing, make sure you get a needle and seat just to avoid that issue. Improper float height. All right, so our next one's going to be improper float height. And your float height needs to be set properly. So the float height right here, if you don't have a measurement, you can see that seam is the same level as the carburetor body bowl line right here. If you start with a baseline like that, if you don't have a measurement, but if this is too high where you have your float sitting up here, it can overflow the carburetor. And you'll see a lot of that happening when the bike is on a side stand. If you have a bike that has a dirt bike with a side stand or a street bike and you put it on the side stand and the float level is so high that it raises up over the top of this and it starts to spill out. So make sure your float height is set properly. If it's set properly, putting the bike in a kickstand, you shouldn't have any leaking coming out of your overflow tube. All right, so corroded drain screw. This drain screw right here comes out. Let's see, this one doesn't have because it has that. Yeah, this one right here. So this screw comes out. There's an O-ring on that and is a kind of a wedge at the bottom of this. Let me pull it out for you. All right, so this is what this looks like here. There's an O-ring right here, and there's a tip. So this tip can get, and you can see this one's pretty rusted. It gets corroded. It goes inside of here, and it seals all the way down the bottom right there. So when you park your bike, if you're ever going to park it for a long period of time, I always tell people drain your bowls. Don't leave any fuel in your carburetors, and you'll avoid a lot of these issues. But loosen this. It'll drain it straight out of the overflow right there. If this gets really corroded, when you put this in, it can constantly leak past this and leak past and leak out of your overflow tube right here. So you want to make sure that your needle is looking good and it's looking clean. This has a shiny section where it seals, and the rusted part is where it sat in here, where moisture got down in there and rusted it. So that's another reason right there. Your drain screw can be damaged, corroded, or it could be the wrong one. If someone else had your bike before you and you're trying to diagnose this, it could be just the wrong one, wrong seal in there. All right, so the last one is going to be your bowl gasket. That seems pretty common sense, but a lot of times people think that the gas doesn't go above that. A lot of times when the bike is sitting on a side stand or leaning, the gas will get just above this seal, where it's not high enough to get into the overflow tube, but it's high enough to get there. This seal should be sealed up against your carburetor body. If this is old, worn, dried, flat, it won't seal good on there. So you want to make sure your float bowl gasket is nice and rubbery and thick and round. And when you look at it here, if you look from the side, I try to take a something flat and just put it along here and make sure that you're pivoting on top of the rubber gasket and you can feel it. If not, it's too flat and you need to replace it. All right, guys, so those are all the issues. We're going to do a quick recap here. We have our overflow tube being cracked, the corroded needle seat, the hard rubber on the needle and the tip of the float needle. We have a stuck float needle where it's stuck and you have to hit the side of the bowl. We have a cracked float where the float fills with fluid. We have dirt inside the seat from dirty fuel or your fuel lines are coming apart. We have the O-ring around the side of the needle seat that could be shot and worn out. We have improper float height, corroded drain screw, and a bad bowl gasket. Those are all the reasons that your carburetor may be leaking. Of course, there's a couple other ones: damage to your carburetor, corrosion in areas from moisture, different things. Also, this cap is 17 millimeter. There's an O-ring below that. If that's stripped or your O-ring is bad, it could leak out of the bottom of that. But most of the tips that I talked about here are all going to be coming out of your overflow tube, except for the bowl gasket. So guys, check all those out. Get those bikes to stop leaking, and your bike will run a lot better, and it will stop dumping all your fuel all over your garage floor. Or if you got a mower, it's going to stop filling up your crankcase with gas. Well, there you go, guys. Those are the top 10 reasons that I see, that I come across when I'm working on carburetors and that are leaking. So just go through all those. You'll be good to go. Some of them are going to affect the way your bike runs. Like if your float level is too high, it's going to make your bike run like crap anyway. So make sure you check that. Check all those things. It's going to stop your bike from leaking. Hopefully this video helps you out, guys. Please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell for further notifications. It really helps me out. And until next time, this is Tepcocyclerepair. Time to work in that jigsaw. Woo, baby.